Hi everybody, I'm back. Finish up the sentence, what you were just saying to your friend next to you. So, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies has a seeming problem with its title. What that might be. A seeming problem with our title. I'll let you know. I'll disclose it. The International may suggest that our mandate is to study peace, justice, and the reduction of violence out of the United States. This could not be farther from the truth. For us, the United States is part of the global system that concerns us in our research, teaching, policy, and practice. This is manifested in the classes we offer, in research and practice of some of our faculty, in dissertations that some of our doctoral students are writing, and in the many local internships that our students take here in the United States. For us, South Bend is an integral part of the international and the global that concerns us. For this reason, it was important for us to include a keynote address, one of the keynote addresses, to a speaker who would bring the United States to the center of the conversations that are taking place at this conference. And I was so pleased that Sujatha Baliga accepted my invitation to deliver the keynote address this evening. Sujatha is a director of the Restorative Justice Project, a Just Beginnings collaborative fellow, and a 2019 recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as a Genius Fellowship. Through the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, Sujatha helps communities across the United States implement restorative justice alternatives to juvenile detention and zero-tolerance school discipline policies. She is also dedicated to using this approach to end child sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. Sujatha is a frequent guest lecturer at universities and conferences. She speaks publicly and inside prisons about her own experiences as a survivor of child sexual abuse and her path to forgiveness. Sujatha earned her AB from Harvard and Radcliffe colleges, her JD from the University of Pennsylvania, and has held 2 federal district court clerkships. She's also a long-time Buddhist practitioner, and she's a lay member of the Kyoto Foundation, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Richmond, California. Her talk this evening is titled Prerequisites for Peace, the Call for Restorative Justice in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Sujatha.
Warm hellos, everyone. In Oakland, California, there are many restorative justice organizations, and one of them is run by a dear friend of mine since our teenage years, Sonia Shah, and she has this wonderful exercise in helping people determine why it is that we want to get involved in sort of these helping roles through restorative justice. Many people come to the work not to deal with things that are directly related to our own lived experience. And so how do we interrogate that in a good way? And she asks this question, why are you here? And then she asks it again and again. And then she starts to add the word really, but why are you really here? Why are you really, really here? And by the 7th or 8th, really, things get really uncomfortable, really, 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 really uncomfortable. We get to see some things about ourselves. Well, I have a really, really nice reason for really, really, really being here, and it's David Anderson Hooker, who basically, I'll just go anywhere where he is. So when I got this invitation, I was I was like an immediate yes, even though I had just made a commitment to not do any of this. And especially this time of the year in cold places, because I've gotten really spoiled in California. So, but it's just a joy to be here amongst old friends and new. So, so restorative justice requires us to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. And one of the things I've learned from my teachers in restorative justice is that it's very good that I've become extremely uncomfortable about this fact, which is that everywhere I go in this country, and in many places in the world, I'm standing on land that I have no right to be on. People were here and are here in South Bend who knew land cannot be owned, but that rather that we're held by it, and we barely take the time to notice that, really. And so it's important to say their names, which I will terribly mispronounce, but here were the Kickapoo, and the Masquatan, and the Miami, and the Wee, and the Potawatomi, who were forcibly removed from this land in the 1840s, and some of whom still remain today. So as a restorative justice practitioner who's learned much of everything I know from Indigenous people, I'm really required to take a moment of silence to acknowledge this cruel, unjust, and as yet unresolved truth of our role in the continuation of it and our obligation to work towards justice on this soil, on this land. So if we would just not mind taking just a moment to think about that. Maybe in our hearts, too, to just think about what is a small commitment you can do, even if it's that we just start naming it. That's not a place to stop, but it is a place to start. Thank you. So this talk is titled Prerequisites for Peace, and I'd like to start with a story from my college days. As a college student, I spent quite a bit of time organizing and participating in various protests. And one of the things that I got very accustomed to yelling and screaming at the top of my lungs with my fist high in the air were the words, "No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace." One night, I had a classmate critique me for this, saying that my use of this phrase was threatening to him. As we spoke further, I understood that he experienced it as, if you don't give me justice, I will wage war against you. No justice, no peace. That night, my boyfriend, a sweet revolutionary who was quite committed to nonviolence, and I stayed up really late into the night and talking about what did it mean to chant this phrase, no justice, no peace, as it interfaced with our own personal commitments to ahimsa, in word and in deed. And it occurred to me that no matter how loudly I'd screamed it or how high my fist had ever been in the air, I never meant it as a threat. I meant it as a statement of fact. No justice, no peace. Without justice, there is no peace. Until justice is delivered, there will never be any peace. We are not experiencing peace today, and that's because justice is a prerequisite for it. Justice itself has many prerequisites, particularly when it depends on how you're defining it, right? And some would say it involves things like due process and the fair administration of law. And as a lawyer by training, I see value in those things. But as I've shifted my practice away from the practice of law towards the practice of restorative justice, my primary interest has been in other things. Indeed, I left the legal practice because I saw that the promises of equitable application weren't being upheld in the United States criminal legal system, which I don't call the criminal justice system for that very reason. My clients of color always got more time for similar crimes than my white clients. Rich white kids, if they actually ever got arrested, were given diversion programs. Poor kids of color were not. I developed significant concerns that equitable application isn't possible in our context here, and that even if it were, It's the wrong paradigm for achieving what felt like justice to me. So lest we think this is hyperbole, I have to share a few statistics with you. We have 2.3 million human beings in cages in this country right now. 2.3 million. 7 million under correctional control. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. And you can see Indiana is above the national average. So if you look at this as incarceration rates per 100,000 population, look at the United States as compared to everyone else, and look at Indiana in relationship to all of that. The police across this country are twice as likely to use force against people of color. Black Americans make up 40% of our incarcerated population, while only making up 13% of US residents. I could go on and on about the disparities through statistics and data, but there are also stories of the Black mother who recently wept in my arms about the fact that her daughter's murder will never be investigated, and that her son is serving life on a third strike for a non-violent drug offense. That the stories of the Latinx child who recently told me that he was stopped and frisked one day twice on the way to school, twice by 2 different police officers, and let go, making him late, which led to him getting detention, which led to him getting kicked off his after-school sports team, which led to why he was sitting in front of me due to his contact with the criminal legal system. Or the Black woman who gave birth in shackles, or the woman who was held in solitary confinement for her own protection after she was raped inside a detention facility. So in my last year of practicing law, I was on a team of lawyers representing a man imprisoned in San Quentin Penitentiary for a capital crime. At some point, as I was working diligently on the appeal of his conviction, I found out that the previous year's docket of cases had been completed by the Supreme Court. And what I learned that of the 26 cases that were pending before the California Supreme Court, I heard that all 26 convictions had been affirmed, all 26 of them. And it seemed hard to believe that there was not a single case that presented any issues worthy of deeper review. And I wondered at that moment, even if I offer my client the very best representation I possibly could, am I just a cog in the wheel that will render my client's ultimate execution constitutional? How am I actually helping? And I'm not saying no one should do this work of capital defense. So many of my friends do, and I'm so deeply grateful that they do, because there are far too many people who are still on death row in this country and far too many people in cages. And I was recently at my alma mater a couple days ago at Penn Law School, and the students were asking me, how do I get a job as a restorative justice lawyer? And I was saying, you don't really, that doesn't exist. And they were like, well, how do I end up getting one someday? And I said, be a public defender. If you can stomach it, be a public defender. And a few of them were like, because the cases are really awful, is that why you said, so you like, can I stomach it? Like the facts are gonna be really awful? And I said, no, it's sort of that quotidian injustice that you're gonna see every day. And I would strongly suggest people go sit in an American courtroom, just a regular old district court in your county, and watch the way in which justice is churned out every day. And I really wanted those young, bright law students to go off and be public defenders, because we really have to have deep and intimate knowledge about the systems of oppression that people are caught in, and also to know them well enough to effectively circumvent them someday. So here's an example in my own life today. Many times there are people who I'm trying to partner with to start a robust youth diversion, true system circumvention program. And there will be systems actors who will tell me that, oh, you can't divert that early, we have to charge the child first, or we have to give the kid a probation officer because the law says do. And I can actually say, no, that's not true. Actually your statute says that you can divert, or the prosecutor has discretion to do this. And these are things that I happen to get to know because I practice law. So that's really a blessing. And so my work really is today I do not practice law at all. When I think about what it means to be a restorative lawyer, while there are some people who fold restorative justice into their legal practice, I sort of, again, use my legal tools to circumvent. How do we avoid the system entirely and as early as possible for the most serious crimes possible? And I think that my being involved in this system circumvention camp of restorative justice is also related to the fact that I am in the paradigm shift camp of the way in which people talk about restorative justice. So some of you may know that there is a raging debate in the restorative justice community, primarily amongst academics, about whether or not restorative justice is something that can reform our current system, where it operates in sort of healthy tandem with or deeply connected to our system, i.e. restorative justice courts, et cetera, or whether or not it's just an entirely different way of doing things. And I'm in the entirely different way of doing things camp. But for those of you who don't come to the work of peace through restorative justice, I'll give you a little bit of information. So my three primary teachers in restorative justice are Howard Zehr, Justice Robert Yazzie, the former Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation, and many, many Maori people, too many to name. And so Howard is who really introduced me to the notion of restorative justice as paradigm shift. In his seminal text in the field, Changing Lenses, he opens with some passages from my very favorite book in the whole world, which I recently found out is also one of David's favorite books, Structures of Scientific Revolution, which actually sort of coined the term paradigm shift, right? And so Howard's definition of restorative justice is this. It's an approach to justice that involves, to the extent possible, all those who have a stake in a specific offense to identify harms, needs, and obligations in order to put things as right as possible. And so it's often shown through this lovely sort of breakdown that he's also credited with thinking through these three questions. So what are the three questions that our current criminal legal system asks, which is what law was broken, who broke it, and how do we punish them? And restorative justice asks a very different set of questions, right? It starts with who's been harmed, and what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And there's some additional questions that Howard's added, which is who has a stake in the situation, what are the causes, and what's the appropriate process? And I would argue that we should probably put that last question on the other side too. As an attorney, we did think about process, right, and which process is due, is a question. It's just asked in a very different way on this other side of the set of questions. And so another way that I love the way he frames it is that crime, in essence, is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. And I think that this is something that the entire field sort of owes to Nils Christie in his text, Conflicts as Property. It's a beautiful thing that people should read, which makes really strong arguments that the state stole our harms, is the way I like to think of it, rather than it being myself versus my father, for example. It's the state versus my father. Where do I go in that? So crime, a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. Those violations create obligations. And the central obligation is to do right by the folks that you've harmed. So Howard also talks a lot about a continuum of restorative processes. My boss used to joke, he says, this is Sujatha, she runs our That's Not Restorative Justice Project, because I spend a lot of time being like, people come up to me and say, we do this gang tattoo removal program, we do restorative justice, and I say, that's great, that's not restorative justice. And Howard is kinder than this, and he doesn't run around telling people what they're doing is not restorative justice. He's sort of come up with this continuum from less restorative to the more fully restorative end of the continuum, and there's some factors that he looks at, which I think are useful in his little book of restorative justice. And the work of the Restorative Justice Project, we are just trying to be on the more restorative end of the continuum, right? And so some of those things involve, to my mind, the opportunity for face-to-face dialogue, and involving only the people actually impacted by the harm, not third-party deciders, It orients around the needs of the person harmed. It allows the responsible person to take steps to repair the harm, and that there's family and community support for those things. Those are the key elements of all the work that we try to do wherever we're doing it. This is maybe hard to see. Maybe it's just hard for me to see, but I will try to remember what it is that we do. But in our diversion work across the country, what we do is we try to sort of, you see the top line there is how a young person is generally processed, right? They cause a harm that involves their arrest, which leads to probation and a district attorney getting the case, and then the child is charged and they go to court, and then they're sentenced or they're adjudicated delinquent, and then there is a treatment plan put into place, which is effectively found guilty and sentenced. We have different words for kids, but we don't generally treat them that much differently, except for the fact that we tend to take away their rights. That's the big difference between the adult and the youth context, which usually leads to some sort of form of ankle monitoring, probation/incarceration. And the number one cause of youth incarceration in California, interestingly, is not the original crime, but probation violations. So, okay, anybody here ever late for anything when they were a teenager? By a show of hands, maybe? Just a couple of us, right? If I were on probation today, I would be violating it like every minute of every day today, let alone my teenage child. Like, he would be a disaster on probation. So, literally the most well-resourced child living in Berkeley, California, would fail miserably, with two parents who are super involved, would fail miserably at the conditions of probation, which results in youth incarceration, right? And then an endless number one indicator of future incarceration is youth incarceration, right? Not whether or not you were actually even adjudicated delinquent. So, so we try to circumvent this entire thing. Ideally, at the arrest level, my husband calls it, like, wouldn't it be great if we could go from car to conference? Like, if you're arrested and you go straight to the restorative justice organization, the community-based organization that facilitates these cases. But at this moment, we're primarily working with district attorneys' offices, with progressive DAs across the nation, which we're having this wave of right now, which is super exciting. DAs who are willing to divert cases pre-charge, felony cases pre-charge, to community-based organizations to resolve these cases without any involvement in the criminal legal system. So, very exciting stuff. Basically, the format is that the young person has to consent to the process, and then the person harmed also consents to the process, and then ultimately, the graphics are not quite accurate because it's actually a much larger circle than this. We try to maximize the number of people that we can get in the conference, people who really believe in this young person and who they can be, and natural family and community supports, not trying to pull in new mentors that the kids never met before. This is not a program. This is not a service, right? This is giving people the space to sort things out in their own lives. And the same is done on the side of the crime survivor. And ultimately, they're brought together. There's a plan to repair the harm. It has 4 parts: doing right by the person that you've harmed, your parents or guardians if you have them, your community, and doing right by yourself. And there's like 3 to 6 months to complete that plan. And when that plan is completed, no charges are ever filed against this young person, right? So that's the way we do it. Let me see where I got here. Where I am. Okay, so going back again to definitions and all of these processes and systems and structures and ways in which I interface with the current criminal legal system. So I mentioned my other mentor is Robert Yazzie, the former Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation, and I get to spend time on Dene land with him, learning from just how he is with his people. And he finds definitions of restorative justice to be hubris. He says there's no way to define it, that it is a way of being and a way of life. But the few times I have caught him using a particular phrase that I cling to is that it's moving forward in a good way. Moving forward in a good way. And so I do tell him that I think he has a definition, but he pushes back on that. And I think my Maori guides, like Irimako and Judge Himitamano and Mike Hinton and others who've talked to me a lot about their thinking, is they keep bringing up this word mana. You know, and it's about your dignity and your virtue and your value and your place in the community, your standing in the community. And when you know that restorative justice has happened and gone well, when every single person walks out of a restorative process with their mana intact or increased. And I just think that that to me summarizes it so beautifully. So at Impact Justice, we work in 2 major contexts. One is with youth and young adults, and the other is my sort of more of the area I'm working in now myself, which is in the adult context, in relationship to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, sort of nascent and new areas that we're working in on that front. And we generally use circle process and family group conferencing, which we sort of tweaked into this thing called restorative community conferencing, which is somewhat of a hybridization of the two models. But more than anything, we work with communities to determine what's the best process for them and how will we tweak this to make sense on the ground with you and with the folks that you're working with. So a little bit about the core elements of our process is that, again, it's oriented around the needs of people harmed. We really push for people to not exclude crime survivors. We notice that a lot of people who call themselves restorative justice seem to sidestep actual survivors of actual crimes. And so following the questions, who was harmed and what do they need, it seems kind of important to have them there. And so then our work is specifically designed, I think end is a strong word. I've been spending time with David today and thinking about end racial and ethnic disparities in our juvenile and criminal legal systems. At a minimum, what it is designed to do is end racial and ethnic disparities in diversion. So, for example, a 1 in 20 white kids gets diverted for a certain level of crimes in Alameda County. 1 in 45 black kids for the same types of crime get diverted, right? And so how do we make sure that that does not happen? And what we do is we actually start with data from the probation department. Who are you locking up? For what crimes? And where do they live? And then we start our restorative justice programs with those cases in that neighborhood for those crimes, for those kids, right? Does that make sense? So then we're guaranteed to be doing a program that's going to be impacting youth of color in a positive way, because if you walk into any juvenile detention facility, at least in California where I've been, I've only seen one white kid in there once, one, right? So that's a really important thing to consider. How do we target the kids that would be in those facilities? And so it involves doing more serious crimes, generally felonies in most of the jurisdictions, or high-level misdemeanors that would ultimately result in incarceration, even if it starts with probation. Focused exclusively, again, on pre-charge diversion. We circumvent the system. We don't want kids to be assigned a probation officer, have to go to court, et cetera, et cetera. It's structured to prevent net widening, again, by doing more serious crimes, dedicated to a strengths-based approach to healing harm. You know, I think I'd heard it earlier today that if you walk into a community and you say, oh, we've noticed something's wrong with you, would you like to work with us? That doesn't go very well, right? And so with us, the first meeting that we have with anyone, we start with like, what do you believe in about yourself and what are you good at? What is really starting with strength? I'd like to get to know you from a place of my own heart. And then rooted in relationships, like how do we nourish, deepen, and heal them, which is related obviously to the point above. And then really committed to protecting participant confidentiality. We only work in jurisdictions where the district attorney will agree to sign an agreement that says that nothing that happens in restorative processes can be used in a court of law. And we get DAs to sign this. And it really creates, that in and of itself creates the ground of trust, where when we go and talk to people who are either, as people who've done harm, terrified that an admission of responsibility would ultimately be used against them, or to crime survivors of color who are not interested in seeing their own locked up anymore, right? The people would be willing to participate as survivors based on this confidentiality agreement. So we are trying to develop more and more data about the effectiveness of our work, and we've been successful, even though in the beginning we did get lots of pushback from our community partners about getting data about the work, and it was reasonable, and particularly the critique was, the government doesn't have to tell us how effective they are, right? Like conviction rates aren't particularly effective when you look at recidivism rates, and people would push back on this all the time, and so I said, well, what if we compare you to them? And they were like, well, what's that going to look like? Everybody's still going to say we screwed it up. I said, hold up. Let's think about this. We're going to study whether or not catching a kid, telling them we love them, and supporting them to make it right by their crime victim, if they're going to do better than locking that kid in a cage and calling them a juvenile and giving them a probation officer. And everybody was like, okay, let's do that. Let's compare those two things. And unsurprisingly, the recidivism data shows that we showed a 44% reduction in recidivism for youth who went through the restorative justice conferencing process. That's 2 years out. Obviously, cost savings are astronomical. In Alameda County, it costs nearly $500,000 to lock up a kid for a year. And this is $10,000 at max per case. This is with like all the bells and whistles. And so sadly, a lot of funders didn't think that this data, because everyone needs an evidence-based practice, and for some reason, a comparative match sample was insufficient. People wanted a randomized control trial. And so this did not sit right with us. I did not want to roll the dice about which kids were going to get the thing that was going to be better for them. But then it turns out that the community-based organization, but it turns out that the community-based organization we were working with didn't have enough funding to take all the cases that then became eligible after the DA started seeing this data. And so then we had this surplus of kids that couldn't be in the treatment group and could be sent to the control, which was to prosecute them because they were going to be prosecuted anyway, because we only work with felonies. And so we did a 2-year randomized control trial, and the data was even better. 13% of children who completed the restorative justice program in San Francisco recidivated, 13. And the children who were simply charged with a crime have a 53% recidivism rate. So when people were thinking the comparative match sample would work, more in sort of the program's favor, it was actually the opposite, which I found interesting. So we're working in victim satisfaction. So 91% of participating survivors said that they would participate in another conference if they were victimized again, and also 91% said that they would recommend the process to a friend. And this was high levels of satisfaction on a scale that we looked at. Interestingly enough, we can't do a comparative analysis because the government doesn't keep track of whether or not survivors are actually satisfied with the criminal legal system. Think about that. Okay, so in 7 cities, 4 of them in California right now, working to circumvent the criminal legal system entirely. These are the ones we're starting with now. We are limited only by funding at this point because we've created training manuals and all the technical assistance folks on the ground need, and we're trying to do things really light touch because we find pretty quickly that when you find amazing, dedicated folks on the ground who really want to do this themselves, that it takes off pretty quickly. So, and so some of the folks, for example, are the Soul Sister Leadership Collective in Miami, who are doing a gender-specific restorative justice program to address the incredible increase in the criminalization of girls in Miami. We've got the RISE Center for Youth in Richmond, California. These kids are amazing. We also have the Rafa Institute in Nashville. This is the photo they sent us. And one of the things I love about the Rafa Institute is that Travis Claybrooks, who's there on the end, is a former police officer who felt like that is not what he needed to be doing to be helpful to kids, and now does this instead. So pretty cool. So we can't do the work everywhere, but we did just put online our Restorative Justice Diversion Toolkit, rjdtoolkit.org. It is 178 pages of material, information, forms, files, everything that you could possibly need to get a restorative justice diversion program started in your community. Hopefully we will, we're really excited to be giving it away. It feels really important to be able to give it away. And because people can start this themselves, everyone's like, what does it take? And I was like, what did it take for me to do it? I meet people like Wakumi Douglas in Miami all the time who run circles around me. Like, she should be running this stuff, and she doesn't need much to get it started other than if we just redirected some of this money we're wasting on prisons into her program. I can't imagine how effective she would be. She already is. So, and just a little bit about who it's for, right? Again, it's really important for us to name that our work is for community-based organizations to lead the program and lead the program creation. Okay, this is super important to keep in mind. This is where we see true success. And that while juvenile legal system actors can use what they learn from the Restorative Justice Diversion Toolkit, it's not really for them to lead its implementation. Or community organizers, again, really beneficial for putting the pressure on the systems partners to divert the cases to the program. But again, it's really about the community-based organization that's going to be embedded in community, working closely with community that they're already trusted by and familiar with. That's who we really do this work with. So, oops, sorry. got ahead of myself. A little bit about the work I'm doing with intimate partner and sexual violence. I've been really blessed to be working in a local jurisdiction with a family justice center and a group of organizations working to end domestic violence in culturally specific ways, like Narika and the Rainbow Center and the Latina Center. And all of them are getting trained in circle and family group conferencing. And it's really powerful because historically restorative justice has been rejected in the intimate partner violence context. And people literally feared that they wouldn't be able to get federal funding because it was too close to mediation, which was never allowed under the law based on like VAWA-related funding, because it was seen in the past, domestic violence got sent to mediation by courts, and that actually ended up being quite lethal, right? And so it's really important for us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater about what we've learned from what we used to call the battered women's movement, and start folding in those amazing tools that we've learned from them, like lethality assessments. But how do we reframe that to be like, how do we keep families safe? What do we know from the work that's already been done? And I'm also doing a little bit of work in India now, which is really amazing. So there was a piece on work I had done on a homicide case that came out in the New York Times, I guess it was about 8 years ago at this point. And the title of that piece is called "Can Forgiveness Play a Role in Criminal Justice?" And it was about a young man who had taken his fiance's life. He was 19, so he was an adult technically. And that piece got a lot of play all around the world, including in India. And in that article, it had named that I was the facilitator and that I was quite public about my own history surviving rape and child sexual abuse. And so the calls started coming from India because that article came out 1 week after the Nirbhaya case. And this call for punitive responses and the death penalty for juveniles, et cetera, was actually, there was a lot of pushback from feminist groups across India saying that's not what we want to do. And so a lot of people started to call me and write to me and sorry, there's a back, okay, yeah. Actually came to visit me and started to come to the US for our restorative justice trainings. And then my cousin happens to live in the cities where a lot of these organizations exist. So I started to go back on vacation and then spend 3 days in circle with folks. And really this, what we're calling, anti-carceral feminists started to really develop there in India. And there's 6 organizations now that I'm deeply connected with, and just watching this work grow there. And the fact that it's being led by organizations that were originally dedicated to working with survivors of sexual violence. I mean, this is literally my dream come true. So a little bit more about the prerequisites of peace and thinking about it here in the United States, though, which is primarily where I live and work. My spouse and I recently took our 13-year-old son to Montgomery, Alabama, to see the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And I strongly suggest that every single person who is either living or visiting this country make that our first stop, the Legacy Museum. So Brian Stevenson, whose heart and brainchild that is, Brian says that truth and reconciliation are sequential. Truth and reconciliation are sequential. And so as a restorative justice practitioner and as a sort of linear thinker, I'm always like, how do we operationalize that, right? What are the steps in the middle? What happens between truth and reconciliation? And why don't we require that, not just of the young people that I work with, right, but of our nation state? So, because we really never have in this country, and that is an incredible, incredible failure. So, I have some ideas about sort of what some of those steps might look like, and these are just sort of nascent thoughts, that truth and reconciliation are sequential, but that these might be some of the things, and not necessarily in this order, which are that truth telling by those who've experienced harm and those who've caused it. And these are both about these interpersonal truths, but also structural truths, and how the former are often born of the latter, right? Acceptance of responsibility, an ascertaining of needs, and particularly self-identified needs of those who've experienced harm and those who've caused it, right? Instead of us guessing that crime survivors of X need blah. I can't tell you how many therapists I've been to who told me what I needed that were totally wrong. And sometimes those of us working with folks who've suffered, we can be pathologizing in those same ways. So really important to listen and to have no judgment as we listen, right? And then reparations and repair, both for the past and for the structures and systems that gave rise to the harms that we're experiencing in the first place. And then, really important to think about a credible plan to prevent recurrence, right? And confidence that this plan can and will work. And it's only then that we're going to have the possibility of reconciliation and lasting peace. And we've surely yet to even really begin that work in any sort of meaningful way here. And and I hope that some of this explains, and sets the stage for why it is that in the U.S. context, I really don't believe that restorative justice processes can happen unless they're circumventing the criminal legal system as it currently operates. So I know things are not perfect elsewhere, but I am always deeply moved when I go to places like Canada and New Zealand, where at least, historical and structural harms are acknowledged by the government that caused them from time to time, not sufficiently. And yet, in New Zealand, when you walk into the National Museum, there's this huge replica of the Treaty of Waitangi, right, where it's like rat-eaten, and it's like this deep analysis of how it having been eaten by rats is an analogy for what has happened to the treaty and the way in which the Maori people were and are treated. On more than one occasion, I've heard a government official say, when we violated the Treaty of Waitangi, right? And I'm trying to imagine in the United States any federal government official even knowing that we have treaties or what their names are. Seriously, right? And we also don't take time to recognize that the White House and the US Capitol building were built by enslaved people. That the government kept records of paying slave owners for the labor that built all of our early federal government buildings. So Brian Stevenson often speaks about how there are markers throughout Germany showing the history of the Holocaust so that it doesn't recur, he says, right? And an intention that seems on a global scale even more important today than ever. After befriending people who've served time in Angola Penitentiary, literally a plantation that incarcerated people still work on today, and after watching this short Equal Justice Initiative film called Slavery Evolved, and visiting the EJI Museum, I learned that it's not a matter of slavery not recurring, but it's a matter of it finally ending. And until it ends, we can't participate in any of it if we want to stay true to the principles of restorative justice. Restorative justice can't be an add-on to something that is this fundamentally flawed. This is why I don't believe in restorative justice courts or tribunals really as a primary way of doing things here. I also have deeply personal reasons for not believing in third-party decider models generally. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, sexual violence, including rape and incest, and I'm personally invested in the success of my work to make safety and accountability something at the family and community level a possibility. And it's that possibility of circumventing the systems that we have today that resonates with the child that still lives inside of me. As a young person growing up in rural Pennsylvania, where I was the only child of color in my school, it was the very systems that were in theory designed to protect me that ensured my silence about the abuse I was enduring in my home. I didn't want my father arrested or locked up. I didn't want potential immigration consequences for my mother and my sister. And I surely didn't want to be taken away from any of them, including my father, to be placed in foster care where surely no one would speak my language or eat our food or practice my religion. I always have been deeply distrustful of any top-down approaches because I could see, even as a child, that others did not know better than I do about what I need. So a prerequisite for peace, to my mind, is the removal of those kinds of structural oppressions that prevented the truth-telling that was required for the justice that I needed to be at peace. Those structural oppressions are the racism of what I think of as the crimmigration CPS cluster muck of South Central Pennsylvania. And so the starting point for the production of justice, then, is the removal of those kinds of cluster mucks that we live with today. So there's so much more, and I've hit the end of my little timer here, that could be said, but I really do want to leave a lot of time for question and answer. And I just would close with just one reminder that no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Thank you. you. Thank you. Thank you. We have
so
somebody
for
with a mic
Q&A, if you people can raise their hands, and I'm happy to bring the microphone over to you. Well, maybe we'll do, Sujatha, are you comfortable doing 2 or 3 questions? Mm-hmm. And then, okay. Roger?
Hello, thank you very much for that. Very inspiring, wonderfully inspiring. I'm Roger McGinty from Durham University. On the timeline that you set out, it was interesting that a choke point was that the person harmed has to consent to the process. And it strikes me as an outsider to this land who gazes at this land in sometimes in bizarre wonderment that there is a celebration of retributive justice culturally.
Yes.
So I wonder, could you tell us a little about that choke point, about how people who have been harmed can be encouraged to go down the proper route?
Yeah, so this is a huge part of our training, and we've actually pulled it out of the training and have created a second training on this to make sure that we do keep high levels of victim participation, survivor participation. And really, it's interesting because I never had this problem and I didn't anticipate this problem would happen when I started this work in 2008, when I started actually facilitating cases in 2008. In the first 25 cases I did, I only had one survivor who did not want to participate directly. And that person actually requested a surrogate in their own family to play the role. And so then when I started teaching other people how to do this, and everybody's come back being like, we can't get anybody to say yes to this. I had to do some deep thinking about what it is that I did that made it comfortable for people. And so I think people were doing some funny things, like approaching survivors with we have this great program for kids. It's really going to help this kid stay out of jail. Yeah, that's not the way you want to talk to somebody who just, was carjacked. Like that, they don't want to hear that, right? Or what does it mean to start with the question, how are you harmed and what do you need? And to spend multiple meetings going through the answers to those questions before you say, before they reach the point being like, who was this kid and why did they pick my house? And then you say, oh, well, it's interesting. You have the opportunity to meet with them and ask them those questions yourself if you would want to. Not selling a restorative justice program. And so by the time we get to the point where I'm saying, oh, you have that opportunity, actually, everybody's like, yeah, I want to meet that kid. I want to tell that kid a thing or two, right? So it's really about taking your time. And that is why it can't run in tandem with the system, because the system's on its own clock, unless it needs to delay. I mean, I've certainly been an attorney where I was watching delay cause my client to sit pre-trial for a really long time, right? But generally speaking, if we're trying to operate on somebody else's timeline instead of the timeline of healing, which involves the timeline of trust, it's not going to go very well. Yeah, but in general, we do have a very punitive culture, and we do really encourage people to. I was a victim advocate before I went to law school, and when working in relationship to the system, the victim advocate actually sits in the prosecutor's office in the U.S. It's not an independent entity. In other countries, it is. And I've been arguing for a long time that we need to move victim advocacy out of the DA's office because there's an agenda there that may not align with survivors' agenda. And one of the times I was working on a case, I was actually encouraged to keep my victim as angry as possible for trial, right, for the testimony. So, I mean, unless we start to just really want to hear what survivors have to say. So my side job, I'm trying to help build a victims movement, a crime survivors movement is what we call ourselves. For those of us who don't believe that prison is the answer, right, or feel that there's an amazing amount of waste on that sort of system. It's called Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And we're building that here, trying to push back against that narrative. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hello. My name is Erica Maurer, and I'm from Avila University in Kansas City, Missouri. And when you were speaking about organizations who work with battered women being skeptical, I myself was skeptical about restorative justice practices in domestic violence situations, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what that looks like.
Sure, absolutely. So just really briefly, we know that 50% of survivors do not contact the system at all, and of the 50% who do, 20% say it made them less safe. I got that data from the head of the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice. It's really important for us to keep in mind that 70% of survivors are currently being disserved by the current system, right? And so when we think about the number of people who stay, from a hashtag why I stayed, right? And when you looked at those hashtags, it was really powerful to see how many people who said, because I love him, right? And that we pathologize that as well, right? So let's think about those survivors. So some folks are gonna wanna leave. And the approach that we took for decades was orders of protection, get her to a shelter, get her out, right? And then there's everybody else who didn't. And those people stay together. So what does it look like for us to invest in processes that encourage people to be violence-free, right? And could restorative justice be a tool in that toolbox, right? When I call restorative justice a tool, I hear Justice Yazzie on my shoulder being like, it's not a tool. Okay. A way we move forward in a good way. So I think it's really important to keep our minds open to it and to why it is that I wanted to help build this in deep community with people who are long-time advocates in the domestic violence context, is that I don't think that everybody should run out and do restorative justice for anything just because they got a circle training. I think we will see the same failures that we would see with anything with somebody who doesn't have deep underlying knowledge of the patterns and structures. So when we're doing a restorative justice training around intimate partner violence, we're going to look at the power and control wheel. We're going to look at cycles of violence and how they operate. People are going to have to be aware of those types of things, right, in order to engage in it. And so I think we need to do it very cautiously and very thoughtfully and in deep community with the folks who are doing it. But when in the past people have walked into the Family Justice Center as a couple saying, we need help, and we've sent them away, I mean, that still turns my stomach, right? And now when they show up and they say, we need help being violence-free in our family, right? Or I want to work with him for him to be less violent, or he comes and says, I need help, right? And we're going to stay together. And we know they are going to stay together. How about we give it a try? Again, very much at the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you for this really inspiring talk. My name is Michelle Aparthe. I'm an independent academic associated with the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research and an alumni of the master's program. I used to work with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so I can totally relate to what you've posted here on this slide. And yet, the TRC having a slogan, truth, the road to reconciliation. One of the things that Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, was very strong about was the importance of systemic and structural reform. So I noticed you saying in a comment on this slide the importance of removal of structural oppression. So I'm wondering, to what extent does your program and your work in restorative justice actually then also try to affect policy and legislative change to change the very criminal justice system that creates and reproduces these kind of injustices for people of color and other minorities? Absolutely.
So this is the question. This is the million-dollar question about will restorative justice end mass criminalization and its racism, et cetera, et cetera. I generally answer no, it won't. I imagine I work in deep community with people working to end mass criminalization in this country. And I believe that restorative justice only plays one small role in it. As it currently stands, it is the way we will do things when that falls. We need an alternative. I don't even want to call it an alternative because it is the way, right? We need a good way when we stop doing the bad way. And its existence is evidence towards ending that. The reason I keep track of data is another way of pointing out the flaws in this. Right? It's not just so that my organizations that work with me have data to back up the evidence-based practice so they can get funding. It's also to, make us more aware of what a grotesque failure the current criminal legal system is. So I more think about my work and in terms of the structural oppression, et cetera, is to be aware of it in our implementation of it, right? So a lot of people are like, restorative justice is the answer, the circle is the answer. And if the police are just sitting in the circle with the kids, then everybody will just stop being racist. No, that's not going to happen. I have seen police say really horrible things in circle. Okay, so I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind. So I don't believe that this is a panacea. I think that it's almost as if it's asking, like, 5 warriors with big hearts and spears who are essentially naked to go up against 50,000 tanks. Right? I don't think it's a fair question of restorative justice. And so could it be a piece of what helps the thing fall? Yes, but to my mind, there've got to be a million things that make the thing fall. And we were talking earlier today about how for a long time 2 paradigms existed at the same time. The idea that the earth was in the middle and the sun revolved around it, and then there was the sun. And I think of the sun in the middle as like the liberation view, the non-binary view, right? And that, there's still got to be people pointing out the anomalies, right, with the bad math that is required in order to have the earth in the middle. And when enough people point out enough of those things, one day, suddenly, we're over here in this paradigm. But in the meanwhile, we just got to do our thing, and hopefully nobody's going to get executed for it, right? For believing that the sun's in the middle, right? It's going to take a while. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elaine Pratt. I'm with the University of Melbourne, Australia. One of my past lives was I was a public defender, or the equivalent in New Zealand. And then someone stole my cell phone, one of my, my customers. And I became a prosecutor, so a district attorney. I did see him in the courts at some point, but a conflict of interest, I can't prosecute him. But I guess this is kind of a confession time of what it's like to be in the criminal justice system as a young lawyer. And as a young lawyer, I have a boss to kind of work for, and we call them the Crown Solicitor, and so I'm the Crown Prosecutor. And you're guided in terms of the sentences that you offer, and when you go in front of the judge, you're guided by guidelines, by cases of what's been given before. And I imagine that the Crown Solicitor would have a lot of say to say, I'm comfortable with this ban of number of years. And so as a junior lawyer, you would be guided by that. Now, I was very fortunate to have a very compassionate Crown Solicitor. But I see now, looking back, that I was also trapped in a structure, and the sentences that I offered was limited by the structure that I was working in.
Sure.
Now I try to be a peace builder, but I see that when I was in that system, I did think in terms of structure. And I just wonder whether there is existing programs to reach out to people in that equivalent position to help them see structure. Because I recall laughing, or well, not laughing, but listening to Maori defendants go up and say, I do not accept the sovereignty of this court. I do not see my sovereignty. It's not legal to try me. And that was considered not a legal statement and was just ignored. And so I'm just curious if there are things in what you do speaking to lawyers, but also maybe the senior lawyers, because I gauge that it's not the same here. It's a political appointment, so it's perhaps not as easy. Yeah. I'm also thinking about how you talked about the treaty. And the Treaty of Waitangi was reinterpreted or interpreted in 1987, and that was roughly the time of apartheid, and so the times were ripe. And also maybe you could comment about what conditions, maybe not so much in terms of like which president comes into power, but maybe even lower than that, what are the conditions that could help America kind of the tide turn? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your confession. No, it's not easy for prosecutors, but I really appreciate it. So with regard to structure, I think it's really hard when people have had power and have been given power through structure to be able to give up power, right? And I think that is the heaviest lift in some ways. And I'm going to backpedal a little bit on this notion that if you just sit in circle, things will soften. And I do actually put a bunch of, like recently, an entire sex crimes division of a prosecutor's office in circle to talk about why they have to throw the book at these guys all the time. And many of them confess to being survivors. One of them confessed to having perpetrated. And that was really intense. I was like, wow, okay, okay, here we are. And to be able to get people to, and what has happened since that is that office has been calling us to see whether or not restorative justice might be available in some cases that they never considered it for before. So is that structural change? Not necessarily. Where I find it really interesting is that our program requires, to work with us, we really ask district attorneys to be done with their discretion, which is their biggest power in this country. You pick a class of cases, this crime, this many priors, this age group, this zip code, and then all children go that are eligible based on that criteria go. And so that's a way that you can start to get people to sort of get more comfortable with giving up the structure that gives them power, right? And the structure of infinite discretion that district attorneys have to charge, to not charge, to whatever, to charge it as whatever they want to charge it. And just trying to wear away at that and actually getting them to trust that would be a good thing. And with regard to the conditions that give rise to us acknowledging this, I think that I'm not a fan of shame. So I don't think we're going to shame people into that. I'm really not. I really think shame is not beneficial. So it's not that, to my mind. For me personally, when I think about ways in which I have privilege in the world that is unearned and that I have misused, that when I let it go when there's a freedom in letting it go, or there's some gift to me. So what is the gift that we might give ourselves if we understood that we are on occupied land and did something to repair that? How much happier might we be if we started to do those things? And I just got to say, I need to not make everywhere better than here, but I don't know, go to New Zealand, people just seem happier. It seems easier to just admit that this is true. I feel that way in Canada. I feel like across the border, and I'm like, okay, at least we could admit, like at least you had some sort of TRC here, something started. That it's not as a survivor, when I lived with lie upon lie upon lie, that was a terrible way to live, right? When I've caused harm and I'm trying to cover it up, whether I've benefited from shady stuff, right? Which is what it is living in this country, right? Especially as a person with immense privilege in this country. It feels shady, right? And so it always feels better when I start to name those things. And so I'm hoping that we can start to create spaces in which that happens. So. Yeah, we have one over here.
Thank you so much. This has been unbelievably inspiring. So just a couple of quick comments and questions. Susan Page, I'm a visiting faculty member at the Keough School I've been a practicing diplomat for most of my career, but I'm a lawyer by background. So I have immense privilege by education, status, but I'm still a woman and a woman of color, and so a police officer doesn't know that that's where I come from. So, right. But I wanted to just comment first that today is the 81st anniversary of Kristallnacht. Nobody has actually said that tonight, and I just wanted to kind of mention that. And it's also the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall falling. So kind of this weird, sorrowful, and joyful in a way with what happened with the Berlin Wall falling. Is there any way that restorative justice can do something for those things that happened so long ago?
Beautiful question.
So I'll leave it at that because I know.
Well, I want to actually have you say a little bit more about what it is the 81st anniversary of.
Sorry. So the pogrom began in Germany in 81 years ago today, and it was very violent against the Jews in Germany at that time. And it began really a series of violations that continued for years against the Jewish community, which then basically was kind of the marker of the start of the Holocaust.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you could also say why you spell your name with small letters, because I think that represents something. And I think that might give us some additional insight. Thank you.
I would just point you to the work of Margaret Burnham at Northeastern Law School, yeah? Northeastern Law School, the Restorative Justice and Civil Rights Clinic there is specifically dedicated to using restorative justice in ways that looks at historical harms, history of lynching, et cetera, what can be done through restorative justice and lawyering in tandem with each other to excavate things from decades upon decades upon decades ago. Margaret Burnham, yeah, I do. I see you writing it down. Margaret Burnham, I cannot say enough good things about this human being and the work that she does, literally pulling up cold cases from our civil rights past and getting markers. And it's, it's similar in some ways to the work that Brian is doing. I think that it is in tandem in some ways. And in other ways, the very specific interrogation and nature and talking to people who might still remember or whose granddaddy it might have been, right, is really beautiful stuff. And so with regard to things outside of this country, I am pretty ignorant. And I think being of Indian descent, I think I need to learn more. I think about it particularly in regard to partition and how we really need to be doing things around that before we forget. I mean, my mother has some vague memories. That generation is dying. And so I think we really need to do some deep thinking about what was done at those times. My name, honestly, it started out as aesthetic. In some ways, because of my own, I liked as a child the poetry of E.E. Cummings, and even though it was deeply problematic in some ways around gender, there were ways in which there was positive notions of sexuality that were healing to me at a time when that wasn't. And there was something about just the aesthetics of it I liked. And then later in life, I started to read John Powell and bell hooks, and then I started to think about, well, why do they do it? And then to me, in brief, I often say, like, if I, I'm not a theist anymore, but when I was, right, it just seemed silly to put ourselves on the same level. And now that I'm not, I sort of think that there's some value to not thinking I'm more important than this podium, because then I won't be as likely to, like, scratch it up and throw it out, right? And that I just think humans need to de-escalate our importance in the world, and we may be less likely to cause environmental degradation if we did, right? So that's just, but I mean, it actually backfired, and I was trying to make myself, and it draws all this attention now, so I wouldn't recommend it. Now I'm kind of stuck with it. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I have a feeling... I have a feeling that we could go on and on and on, but I think we should stop here. Thank you so much. This has been really inspiring and important moment in this very rich conference as it is, and you have enriched it even further.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay.
We appreciate it. Thank you all for coming tonight. See you tomorrow at breakfast and another half day of interesting conversation. Good night all.